Thank you all for being here. I'm Stephanie Friedhoff. I'm Special Projects Manager here at the Nieman Foundation. And I wanted to first, she's almost leaving, I want you to acknowledge Christine Kay, who has been in charge of this event for our events team. She's making sure your blood sugar levels are up to the task of the kind of thinking we're having today. I wanted all of us to give an applause to Christine Kay. Hey. And then, of course, there's a whole team involved in making this happen today, especially as the Nieman Foundation is entering the future with our live stream. Hi to everybody who's watching, of course. There's Kevin and Charles here. There's Barbara McCarthy upstairs, our web designer. There's Jonathan here, who's live tweeting or live blogging the events through Cover It Live. So there's all kinds of ways that we're trying to let other people participate, which is quite exciting and new for us. Turn my notes around. So this is the panel on press freedom as a human right. If you've been glued to the news stream, and that was half a joke for the lingo on the human rights, but I think it's, the people are looking at me. So if you've been glued to the news stream on WikiLeaks the way I have in these past couple of weeks, you've been reading The Guardian, New York Times, obviously. You've probably followed Greg Mitchell's blog. You've been tweeting. You may have seen Daniel Ellsberg chat with Stephen Colbert, or you may have seen Julian Assange intercept a message by President Obama on Saturday Night Live. Since the rollout of the cables, we've been seen so many ideas being tossed around. But there was one day last week, I thought, when things changed. And that was the day when Senator Lieberman tipped the tide on questions about transparency and press freedom that had been bubbling beneath the surface until then. Sure, Mike Huckabee had previously announced he'd like to see someone responsible for this WikiLeaks mess executed, and others were pushing the Assange as a terrorist narrative. But Lieberman did something else. He went after the New York Times. Shouldn't they be investigated by the Justice Department for what they did, he wondered. The question spread through the blogosphere fast on that day, and as we all know, Lieberman and a few others also began to use their business connections to try to dry out WikiLeaks online contributions. From what I saw, it was Glenn Greenwald, and I think he's going to be mentioned here a lot today because he's been such an important voice in the discussion. But Glenn at Ceylon was the first one who asked, what if they had decided to go to the people who print the New York Times and ask them not to print tomorrow's paper? Was that the equivalent of what was happening to WikiLeaks? That would have been an outcry, of course, if the New York Times, they'd asked the people not to print the New York Times. And I thought on that day the discussion was changing, at least for me, and I realize I'm of a younger generation than Kathleen. It was in an unsettling way. It showcased that we cannot take press freedom for granted, even here in the United States, or in Germany, where I'm from, and that we have to constantly negotiate that again, and that we have to make sure people still get what it is all about when the names and the institutions change. And this is why I think we see all kinds of journalists starting to speak up now for WikiLeaks, even though, as God knows, there's been a lot of criticism in the journalism community. It's this kind, oh, sorry. God, I'm nervous. By prosecuting WikiLeaks staff, a letter signed by 20 Columbia Journalism School professors just this week explained to Obama that would set a dangerous precedent. It's this kind of repression, being threatened, prosecuted, and sometimes jailed for pure acts of journalism that Kathleen was obviously also talking about, that our four speakers today know all too well. Where they work in Romania, Chile, South Africa, and Cambodia, comments like those made by Senators Lieberman and Feinstein are abundant and don't create much of an echo. These four are here today to remind us that the fight for press freedom is a global one. They all have a story to tell about how new media tools, including WikiLeaks, have enabled them to circumvent censorship and uncover corruption. And they are vivid examples of the kind of courage that it takes to investigate abusive government, corrupt businessmen, drug dealers, and the like. Take Stefan Candea, our first speaker today, co-founder of the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism and a current Nieman Fellow. He just shrugs when you ask him what it was like to investigate connections between the Romanian president's associates and the mafia organization La Cosa Nostra. We're lucky in Romania, he'll tell you. They just threaten you or take you to court. And by that he means it's not like Russia or Mexico or Pakistan where journalists get killed. Or take Alejandra Matus, who has written about politics and law in Chile and Latin America for more than 20 years. She will tell us a bit, or she can tell us a bit about the national security argument. In 1999, her Black Book of Chilean Justice was banned under the provisions of the Chilean national security law, and she had to flee the country. Her battle for freedom of expression contributed to a reform law, and she could return to Chile in 2001, but the fight for transparency was far from over. We'll also hear from Rob Rose, who heads up the Business Investigations Unit at the Sunday Times, South Africa's most widely read newspaper. On the day he left for his Nieman Fellowship, his office was raided and his colleague arrested. The crime: the two reporters had published undisclosed contracts between South African government entities and football's governing body FIFA, and revealed shady deals struck by FIFA with its suppliers. Last but not least, Kevin Doyle will take us to Cambodia, where he's editor-in-chief of the Cambodia Daily. Now, his paper is the first English-language newspaper in Cambodia, a country where most of the press is controlled by government and where, like Kevin, you can get arrested for publishing comments made by opposition members. When I asked Kevin if he would join us today to talk about how he trains young journalists to investigate corruption and drug trafficking, and subjects like that, and how his paper is being threatened and its journalists jailed, he looked at me and in his perfectly Irish way said, "Well, you think that'd be interesting? It's just what we do, isn't it?" So let's talk about what we do. And the way we're gonna run the panels today, each speaker is gonna talk for 10 minutes and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So let's hear from Stefan first.
Okay. Hi, I'm Stefan Candeas. You heard I'm here to speak about our Center for Investigative Journalism back in Romania, a media NGO that we created, me and two other colleagues, we created back in 2001. And we started working with this center more actively after we had to quit our newspaper, a leading paper back then, co-owned by German Bertelsmann, but also by a Romanian owner who was very involved not only into the business as a publisher, but also in writing daily editorials, in deciding over advertisement publishing, in deciding what gets in the paper and what stays out, and so on. I'll talk a bit how we are working and how we are trying constantly to find ways to get information, how we try to learn how to package this information and to publish the information, because we are publishing online and we are publishing with partners in the mainstream media in Romania and in the region. And I'll talk a bit on how we struggle to finance all this, which is a very challenging and interesting work to do in my region. So I'll go a little bit through the general frame, how it's to work in a country that spent 50 years under communism, and what happens to journalists who do investigative stories or write or cover corruption or write about really important people, politicians or business people, multinational companies. That's not such a big issue because you know, we have 20 years new democracy and big corporations just start to build. Now, when you write about a very big business, you are dealing with very important men behind that business. So we call them those oligarchs in the region. I'll try to talk a little bit about my center reaction to the media landscape in Romania. It's all these 7-8 years I've been working with my center. It was a learning process, and it's still a learning process. We are in a continuous crisis. We are choking for lack of money, but that makes us alert and innovative. We face forever, like for the last 20 years in Romania, we face problems that media in the US and Western Europe just now start to realize that exist. And I think on the long run, we are winning because we are succeeding to build credibility and a network of journalists who respect some ethics and who are honest journalists. Looking back to our work in the region and in Romania, we managed to create a sort of backbone of journalists who are behind all investigative related initiatives in the region. So a little bit about the general frame I work in. As you know, Romania was under communist rule until '89, and that was, I was living in a state, although I was 11 when the communist state collapsed, I still remember how it was to live under this state who knew everything about its citizens, who managed to make people spy on each other, and how it was to live in a state that you knew nothing about your rulers, except from rumors. Along with this huge control from the state and from a dictatorship came a lot of corruption, which during the communist time was coordinated by the Secret Service. It was called Securitate, and it was coordinated on behalf of a nomenclatura that was under direct supervision of a dictator. And, well, this Securitate and the former nomenclatura at some point took over the power, killed the dictator, and we've got a democracy. But 20 years after, as far as I know, out of the 50,000 Securitate agents who were doing this political police, we know the identities of only 3% of those people. And out of 400,000 Securitate informants, we know the identity of less than 1%. Out of these people, out of these 50,000 agents and 400,000 informants, comes today's elite in Romania. So parliamentarians, MPs, judges, prosecutors, business people, and media owners. Media, of course, was during these 50 years just a propaganda tool. It was part of the Communist Party. Oh, I just told that I have 5 minutes left. It was just part of the Communist Party, and so you have to understand this background to understand who is in the media business today. We were told by Chief Justice from the Supreme Court here in Massachusetts that, in her opinion, a functional democracy has to have a free ballot, independent judges, and a free media. We have neither of those in Romania. We have a lot of frauds and buying votes when we talk about ballots. Judges, most of them are connected to financial or political interest. There is a huge distrust of the justice system, or if they are in important positions, they might be blackmailed with their past. The media, except the online media, I don't think that our traditional media is free, because it's owned by local oligarchs whose main source of income is dealing with the state, with public money, and their only goal to, their only motivation to own media is to stay out of jail and to be able to name politicians in different positions. We had, after the Orient Curtain collapsed, we had 2 existing models to look at, like in the successful media models. We were looking at Berlusconi media in terms of ownership, and we were looking at Murdoch media in terms of content. And it was getting better in time. So now if you are zapping Romanian TV, you will see a lot of variation of Fox News media all over the place. That's a simple explanation. People who built media in these 20 years were either entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs, or journalists who used to work for the communist propaganda, and none of them were interested in ethics or quality journalism. Some of them became part of the elite, dealing directly with politicians, trying to advise politicians, doing lobby and so on, but still staying in the media. We just had access to what one of our main media owner was discussing with his media managers, because this media owner is involved in a criminal trial. So his phones were taped by prosecutor, and we could read these leaked documents. So he was instructing his top management for this huge media empire that he wants his media empire to work like his Audi limousine. So when he turns the key on the right, it has to start. When he turns the key on the left, it has to stop. And his media should work like that. If he wants to attack the president, it should attack the president. If he wants to stop the attacks, it should stop. I won't bother you too much with our local frame, I mean the legislation and the problems we have with prosecutors and judges. You may imagine from what I said, we have a sort of FOIA legislation. It's local legislation adopted but not implemented. So journalists who really want to use this legislation have to educate the public clerks that this legislation exists. A lot of times, most of the times, they are refused the information. Journalists have to go to court to sue those people who are refusing to deliver the information. And the court trial in Romania lasts about 5 years, maybe 10. And journalists have to go alone to court. They don't have the backup of their newsroom. Leaked documents like WikiLeaks are a very important source of information. Actually, documents that are available outside the country are a very important source of information, because our local politicians assume that if they control the information in Romania, you cannot get this information, which is wrong. There are a lot of ways to have access to databases outside the country, or to documents compiled by foreign politicians about our country. I was saying that journalists are part of the problem in my country because they get corrupt, because they tend to side with the establishment and they want to be part of the establishment. There is a huge distrust in mainstream media, if you ask me, and there is a reason to that. A lot of information that was given to journalists was misused for advertisement racketeering. Of course, we have we have a lot of taboo topics, but there are ways to avoid this by publishing online. And eventually, if there is a taboo topic that was refused for publication in the mainstream media, you publish this online. At some point, it will make its way to the mainstream media, not immediately. There is pressure from prosecutors or judges on journalists. There is pressure from politicians, and it's like every week you have a new politician thinking to adopt a new piece of legislation that will keep journalists quiet. So you have to understand that to work as an investigative journalist in this media center, we cannot ignore the media landscape. We have to do some advocacy work, and we have to monitor the legislation, and we have to react on abuses. There is a new trend in Eastern Europe. If you publish an investigative story about a really big, important oligarch that has a lot of money, he will sue you. He will not sue you in your country. He will sue you in London, because oligarchs love UK courts now. And there is another, there is a response to that. Some websites deny access for UK visitors to their websites, so that they cannot be brought to court in UK anymore. So there is this pressure that I consider normal until journalists don't get killed, and it would be bearable if you have support in your newsroom, which doesn't happen. When we were working in a newsroom, we faced all kind of really strange situations, like colleague journalists spying on us on behalf of companies, on behalf of business people, or on behalf of the government. But I think about this topic, there is another Nieman fellow who can speak more, Holman Morris, about government spying on journalists. I faced a really strange situation when colleague journalists hacked into our computers and stole the images we gathered or the information we gathered about to be published, and sold this information to the target of our investigation. We would expect support from your editors and from the owner of the media, but that doesn't happen. Actually, the biggest pressures come from them, because they get into shady deals with our target of investigations. So we try to, since we started this work, we try to gather as much documents as we can. We try to gather as much databases as we can. We don't refuse access to any kind of database, whether it's a hacked database or not, because we have so less sources of information. There is a huge difference in how it was possible to work back in '99 when I started to work, and now starting in my newspaper back then, we had no access to computers. We already had typewriters. We had no access to the Register of Commerce, for example. I had to bribe clerks to give us company records. Now everything is online. Now you have access to your computer, and actually most of our work we do at our center is not in a newsroom. It's from each people's home. So I was told to wrap up now. I will get into more details when we get to the question and answers. Yep. Thanks.
It's good to be surrounded to journalists that do the same thing, because this work of investigative journalism sometimes became lonely. And I have had the experience of just writing a story on technology, something to survive the month. And I call somebody and they say, why? Why are you asking me these questions? What are you up to? So it's good to know that we are not alone. Journalism, investigative journalism, the definition we use, at least in Latin America, is to find something that someone with power does not want people to know. And that has been done from a long time, and I think Watergate is our kind of, main moment. But I think it's been done since journalism and communication is around. It's try to find out what people with power in our lives or in the citizens' life are doing. Before technology, we did that with just trying to find the secrets in pieces of papers or just talking to people. And that's what I did with the Black Book of Chilean Justice. It seemed 1999, it seemed a long time ago, because there was the World Wide Web. It was not interconnected as it is today. And I found myself reporting in the courts where everything was secret. The testimonies that were gathered, the decisions the judges took on cases, how they arrived to those decisions. And what reporters did at that time, most of the time, was just to inform the public when the decision was taken. This person was condemned, this person was found innocent, and that was the business. Covering the courts was like covering the less important issue of journalism. Nobody wanted to go there. It was dry, boring, and it didn't produce too much headlines. It was crimes, crashes, and stuff like that. But Chile recovered democracy in 1990, and the human rights violations and all the possibilities of uncovering what happened during dictatorship was a responsibility given to these courts. I don't think Americans could never imagine this, because there was it's a different system of judiciary that comes from the Spanish Crown times, where the courts were not supposed to put in balance accused and defender, but the weight was put on accusing. You were presumed guilty before you were presumed innocent. You had to prove your innocence. And of course, that was difficult if you had no power. And it was difficult without jurors, and it was difficult without press. So there I was at little more than 20 years old, starting to work as a journalist and trying to understand this court and trying to apply the lessons that I learned in school, that we were supposed to make sense and report the relevant issues to the Chilean public. So started from covering the human rights issues. I started to wonder, well, how these decisions are made. How is this possible that these crimes are not being processed, but there were other decisions that were also challenging, like why are they releasing these drug traffickers? Why is this businessman meeting with this Supreme Court judge outside work hours when he's when one of his cases is being decided by this judge? And I started writing stories about that with the help of my newspaper. At that moment, we had more newspapers than we have now. And from that moment, a publisher get interested on writing a book about this issue, about the judiciary role. And I accepted the challenge of doing it. And as Kathleen said, journalism most of the time is boring, and investigative journalism is more boring because it took me 6 years of my life to stay in those courts and talk to people and gain their confidence. And some of them give me some little pieces of documents, and most of them give me information. But that was not the type of information that you will leak to WikiLeaks. It's not in any record, and it's not possible to gather either as using the tools of Freedom Act or any other tools that journalists can have at hand, because people are not going to voluntarily give you information that could make them lose their jobs, or that could give them no benefit. But the ethical benefit of knowing that society might know something that is important. And it's, I always got impressed by the courage of those people, because for me it was my work. I was doing my work, I was doing what I was supposed to do. But they could live very safely and without providing me any information, and without feeling that they were doing something wrong. But during those 6 years, a lot of people took the risk of talking to me and giving me information. And I found out that that was not enough to write a book. It was not enough to know what's going on. You need to know why it should be different. And to know why it should be different, you also need to know the principles of democracy, what a judiciary is supposed to be doing, what society expects of that judiciary, and what is the other countries are doing, and what country is doing it right. And that is a study. That's not using a hiding camera or trying to get a document. That's main simple work of studying, and maybe talking to a historian, social scientist. And all of that, that's what, in my point of view, makes a journalist. It's not just getting that secret out. It's putting it in context, it's giving it meaning, and put it in a language that people could understand. Because that's the other challenge. There was a lot of people when I was doing my work that they say, why you're doing this? Everybody knows. By everybody, they mean them, the experts or the lawyers. And even after I published my book and I was persecuted and all that still people say, why was it big deal? We know more than you published. And of course they do. The people that is involved in the system knew a lot more than when I published. But what I published was what could I defend, that could provide information. If anybody else took the challenge of doing what I did, I could show them how to do it, where to go, what are the traces of the information that I gathered that anybody could gather by themselves and arrive to the same conclusion or to something different. But it was traceable. It's not a gossip. It's not something that I could not sustain. And I think that was the problem with the book. It was not that the book revealed just one secret or the wrongdoing of one person, because that's very easy to control. You can put a person separated from the system, or you can block the access to the information. The problem with the book was put in context a system, a whole system, the whole judiciary that wasn't working. Part of the job was getting the secrets. Part of the job was talking to people and make them reveal information. Part of the job was getting documents. But it's not what journalists do. We just gather that information and put it in context. And I think that's there is some hysteria around journalists. We feel threatened by what WikiLeaks is doing, and I have seen a lot of corporative defense, like saying, no, that's not real journalism, we're the real journalists, he shouldn't have that. I think the most meaningful part of this is that he had to give the information to journalists to process it and to write it. There is enough investigation now in psychology that human beings can only process certain amount of information. We are not made to read thousands of documents and understand what is important, what is not. That's why there is journalists, and to do the boring part of reading, understanding, making sense, and publishing. So I think, as Stefan says, for us in Latin America or many other countries, the existence of WikiLeaks and outside our countries' databases are very important because they are sources of information. But I think that's not the main threat to journalism. The main threat to journalism is the sustainability of what we're doing. Who is going to pay our salary? Who is going to pay professionals to study, to go read boring documents and to make sense out of it and to give it to the public? And that's the challenge we have not seen so far how to solve in the digital era. And I don't think even WikiLeaks have solved it. So I think we can continue. Yeah.
Hi. In the first 20 minutes, I'll give an overview of the structure of media, and then. Okay, I won't do that. I've seen the signs every couple of minutes saying you have 5 minutes left as you start speaking. So I write primarily about the nexus between business and politics in South Africa. It's a country that has quite a vibrant watchdog press that emerged through the apartheid era. There were a lot of newspapers and magazines that challenged the government at the time. So, and the government had a sense of the importance of media challenging government, which helped us in the post-independence stage after apartheid to put the primacy of information freedom and freedom of information to the forefront. So in Africa, you've seen about 14 countries, I think, I suppose South Africa is obviously part of it, putting in place access to information laws, which is a crucial step in terms of this sort of thing. I think the problem has been in implementing those access to information laws, as you see all over the world. You can have the laws, but it can just be the form, not the substance. For example, this week, the South African government was finally forced, after 8 years, to release a judge's report into the Zimbabwe election in 2002, which is 8 years after it happened, amid widespread talk of a rigged election. So, I mean, that's an indication of the fact that the freedom of access to information laws exist, but they're often very difficult to implement and often hold back journalists' work. In a lot of countries, it's one thing to have the actual form, but it's another thing to have the substance. In many of the countries around Africa, the journalists and sources do get taken out. They get killed, and not for dinner or anything, but in a far more, bad way. I mean, we've had Carlos Cardoso, a Mozambican journalist who was investigating bank fraud in Mozambique, involving the president's son, simply shot outside a hotel one morning. In South Africa, recently the World Cup was held in South Africa this year, and it's a huge money-spilling event. And it involves lots of money for people who are willing to get tenders, who want to get tenders from government and from FIFA, the governing body, to build stadiums, to provide services for the event. And in one province in South Africa, there was a hit squad actually assembled to take out journalists who were critical of these contracts, who were looking at how these contracts were awarded, and take out certain business opponents of other people who wish to have a slice of the pie. Two incidents I wanted to talk about. One is a kind of a corporate incident that I think illustrates how WikiLeaks or organizations like WikiLeaks can actually help us. In my country, the banking system evolved to serve the needs of the white minority during the apartheid era. It's a very sophisticated banking system, but as a consequence, 37% of people in the country, adults over the age of 16, don't have bank accounts. And that's primarily because of the high fees, high prices that the banks charge, which lock a lot of people out of the system. I think about half the people in the country have ATM cards. So access to cash and access to banks is a huge issue. 2007, there was a panel convened to investigate high bank fees, to investigate the blockages that exist in the banking sector. And they released a report, quite a damning report as it turned out, but huge sections of it were excised, were censored completely, big black splodges across the pages. So you had no idea what the findings of the panel actually were. Then a company called WikiLeaks came out, and they actually managed to get the uncensored version of the entire bank report, which proved that the panel itself, the independent panel, had excised huge portions of their own findings as a result of the bank's sensitivity. In that case, we were able to get the report and report on that, and that actually helped push reforms in the banking sector and helped accelerate the changes. And it, obviously severely embarrassed the panel and the government who were involved. But it actually, I mean, the purpose of it was, the point is that it accelerated change in the banking system in terms of fees, which was, I mean, I thought pretty crucial at the time. The second case involved the World Cup. I mean, it's a huge event. It's organized by FIFA, this governing body. It's not so popular amongst Americans, but 715 or so million people watched the final across the world, so it's quite a big event. And as I said before, the contracts to build this event are very lucrative. I think about $6 billion was spent building new stadiums, just on building new stadiums in the country. So that's a lot of money that can go to the right people with the right connections. Effectively, FIFA refused to release any of the contracts around this, and the South African government were equally reluctant to disclose where the money was going, how it was going. We asked for it. We were met with a polite hand saying, no thanks. And so some of the newspapers used the access to information laws to go to court to compel the release of information. And that process is still going on. There was an early victory for the Mail and Guardian newspaper, but that is still going on. It's still in the process. Companies love to appeal things. I don't know why. But we got a compact disc CD leaked to us, which contained details of huge amount of contracts involving Johannesburg, the city that hosted the final and the opening game of the World Cup. And this showed, for example, that despite the fact that government was promising huge returns to the citizens for investing $6 billion of their own money in this, that all the money effectively that FIFA was giving the Johannesburg Stadium, the Johannesburg city, was going to a separate third company. And that was never disclosed by the company. Citizens had no idea that the cash was going to be was going to be handed off to a third company for some bizarre reason. And that wouldn't have come out unless we got leaked those documents. As part of that, there's a principle in South Africa of black economic empowerment, which effectively seeks to transfer assets from the white minority to previously disempowered black people. So effectively, 25% of many companies have or should be transferred across, and most companies try and comply with this. But as with any large asset transfers, you get a lot of corruption. I think as you saw in Eastern Europe, you had a lot of, in the post-communist era, you had assets being transferred and huge amounts of corruption in how that was transferred. So in this case, the contracts also helped us to see that some of that third-party company who got the World Cup contracts had a 25% black empowerment shareholder, who I was able to trace to a guy living in a shack in a completely poor neighborhood who had no idea he actually owned the shares. So that's a case of, we wouldn't have found that out. And FIFA and the government certainly weren't keen to let us see that information. But that's crucially in the public interest. And then just a few thoughts on the factors shaping, I suppose, my country and, I've got 2 minutes, shaping my country and the continent to an extent. I think a lot of countries are struggling with the fact that you either have a watchdog media that kind of, does exactly this kind of thing, ferrets out secrets, or you have a nation-building media that kind of seeks to support it, like you have in China, looking for harmony, looking to support the state. And I think what hasn't helped is that countries like China have seen huge economic success, without having a free press, which has vindicated a lot of African countries, I think, that are seeking to repeal the successes, to repeal the freedoms. China's a huge trading partner of Africa and many countries now, and they've used the success of China as vindication for repealing or seeking to repeal certain press laws. In South Africa, for example, there's been talk of a media tribunal. There's a new Information Act, which effectively will give government pre-publication censorship rights. And that's clearly not a very good thing. Like Stephanie said, my colleague was arrested the day I left for reporting about the World Cup contracts. He was effectively taken off to a prison cell, and he was arrested at my building while we were having a discussion on media freedoms and how to react to this new assault on media freedom. So, and the third factor I think is important is exactly the international context, and the way the world reacts has a huge impression on the way countries react further down the line. My country, my continent, like the China example. So I think the way the world reacts to WikiLeaks and the corporate toadying of Amazon and MasterCard will create an expectation that our companies will fold just as easily, and I think that's quite a dangerous slippery slope for other countries. That's not just America's problem. And that's what I have to say.
Indeed, yeah. Hard act to follow with everyone. Good morning. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to speak to you a little bit about my work in Cambodia and speak about Cambodia. As Stephanie has mentioned, my name is Kevin Doyle. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Cambodia Daily newspaper in Phnom Penh. The newspaper was established in 1993 as a not-for-profit entity with the duty or the focus on training a new generation of Cambodian journalists and to bring the best of impartial news to Cambodia and Cambodian people. Cambodia, as you probably know, suffered almost 3 decades of brutal civil war, including the Khmer Rouge period from 1975 to 1979, when an estimated 2 million people died, forced labour, starvation, execution. And those people who were targeted for execution and for killing were the educated class. So in 1993, when the country had its first free election organised by the United Nations and a constitution was implemented, a free press was allowed. So we had the task at that time of trying to help to rebuild a free press in Cambodia. And so that's my newspaper. But I'd like to put into context how Cambodia directly links to today's conference, in that, from Watergate to WikiLeaks. You must remember, before Watergate, there was the Pentagon Papers. And when Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, one of the kernels of information in there was the secret bombing of Cambodia. During the late 1960s and beginning of the 70s, the Nixon administration conducted a secret bombing campaign of Cambodia, which was totally illegal. Cambodia was a neutral country at that time. But they doctored the flight plans of B-52s, and they dropped huge payloads bombs over Cambodia to target what they said were North and South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese sanctuaries inside Cambodia. This killed an untold number of Cambodian villagers, tens of thousands, I presume, we expect. And not only did it kill many civilians, it was totally illegal. The American public didn't know. Congress didn't know. Thanks to the leaking of these papers, this was later discovered. One of the effects of the illegal bombing of Cambodia was it radicalized the rural villagers and it drove them, in many cases, into the arms of the Khmer Rouge, which then led to the terrible things that happened later on in the country. You think, that as Cambodia had suffered so much from these secrets of governments, you would think that, the government now today would be more enlightened when it comes to government secrets, but in fact, it's very much the opposite in Cambodia, where there is no Freedom of Information Acts or anything like it in the country. The Constitution allows for free press, but at the same time, the work of journalists in Cambodia is very difficult. Around a dozen journalists have been killed in Cambodia since 1994, and as far as I know, none of those cases have ever been solved. Cambodia is a fledgling democracy, but oftentimes it's a stumbling democracy as well. And it's a difficult place to work as a journalist. Violence, as I said, is common. It's a country where the court system is compromised, and that it's a highly politicized institution that works on behalf of the government. And in recent years, that court system has been used quite actively and aggressively against journalists to try and stifle free speech. We have defamation laws, which are criminal and can lead to prison sentences in Cambodia. And we also have a thing called disinformation law, and where many journalists have been prosecuted under the law of spreading so-called disinformation. Last year, I know 2 journalists were arrested. One spent a year in prison, and another spent maybe 8 months. I believe since I've been here in Cambridge, both of those journalists have since been released, which is good news. But the fact is that many journalists do end up in prison for the stories they write. If the government decides they don't like what they've written, and they will move against them. I'm not going to focus too much on myself. Stephanie mentioned some things. I myself was arrested and detained briefly, and most recently I've been in the courts a couple of times. It was in 2009. I was prosecuted for defamation, and along with one of my reporters for printing the comments of an opposition member of Parliament who had some critical remarks, in our newspaper about members of the military. And for that, 22 generals took lawsuits against us, and of course we all lost. Now, as I said, there's no freedom of information in Cambodia, but there are very strict laws about leaking information to journalists or anyone else. There's strict laws on protecting government secrets and documents. But at the same time, in a country like Cambodia, we very often receive these documents from those few brave souls in the government who actually are, the military, the police force, who actually think we're doing a good job in the country, and they want to help further free speech. As an example of freedom of information and what it can do, I want to use one example from our paper and what we've covered. And it's when we got access to government documents, how it helped shine light on a terrible chapter in Cambodia's recent history. In 1997, there was a grenade attack on a peaceful rally in Phnom Penh. The rally was against corruption in the judiciary. A couple of hundred people had turned out on a Sunday morning. They were giving speeches. It was mainly women, garment factory workers, ordinary people. And 4 grenades were lobbed into the middle of that assembly, killing 16 people and injuring 120 other people. One of those people injured was an American citizen. Therefore, the FBI was obligated to investigate this terrible atrocity in Cambodia. FBI agents were dispatched to Cambodia and began an investigation. Soon after they arrived, newspaper reports emerged here and in Cambodia that the FBI investigation would be had uncovered information that linked members of the state security forces to the attack. Soon after that, the FBI pulled out, and in the months and probably years afterwards, we were told that in fact the investigation was inconclusive. 2 years ago, we began a Freedom of Information Act request here in the US from Cambodia to have the FBI release to us all the documents of their investigation. And it was my reporter, Douglas Gillison, I'll mention him here because it was a fantastic piece of work, that he began 12-hour difference between Cambodia and the US. So he began his work at 11 p.m. at night after working the entire day in the office. And he'd work into the early hours of the morning, calling the different departments in the US. It took 2 years, many appeals upon appeals upon appeals to have information that was redacted reinserted. They redacted such names as Pol Pot from the official. That's just to give you one example of what was redacted in the first versions. By the very end, after 2 years, we had thousands of pages of documents, and we stitched together basically what the FBI had found out. And indeed, I mean, it was no surprise to anyone in Cambodia. I mean, people, you know, whereas the government keeps secrets from us, you know, the general public knows too well about what goes on in the country. But at least we could release a series of feature stories detailing what the FBI had found out, and basically at the end of the day put the record straight. And again, it was what the FBI investigators had found was that members of the State Security Service seemed to be witnesses, had implicated them in the attack, to the point where the attackers who were seen fleeing from the scene of the grenade attack were allowed through a police cordon, whereas those pursuing them were stopped. You know, details like that. So, again, access to information, very important for us, and it's helped us in clearing up some chapters of Cambodia's history. And we don't have that in Cambodia, but anything that can help shine a light on government secrets, I mean, as a journalist, I feel it's very welcome. You know, there's many of these uncomfortable truths governments want to keep from us, and it's our job to make sure we ferret them out and dig them out. And that's all I really have to say.
Well, do you think it's been cruel for me to put the three of them up here to talk for 10 minutes about all these complex things? It's something that... Sorry?
Four of them.
Four of them, sorry.
Extra torture.
That's something that happens to you when you are an Eamon Fellow. You are your country, and you rarely have 10 minutes, actually, to explain it all. It's also a very humbling experience, of course, to have all these courageous journalists in the mix every year as the world comes together in a nutshell in this building. Stefan mentioned Holman Morris here from Colombia. He's here with Max from Russia. So, you know, we could have had 10 people up here just to show how important this is around the world. Let's start our discussion. Thanks, everybody. Anna. Oh, and please identify yourself for the tape and the live streaming.
Sure. Anna Gorman, I'm an Eamon Fellow this year. You know, in America, as was talked about earlier, we go to the government and we say we have a legal right to these documents, so you have to release them. So a question for Kevin, in a country where there are no laws granting information, how do you and your reporters press the government for that? You know, in addition to waiting for leaks, how do you press the government for information? How do you convince them to give you anything?
We don't. We work around the edges. You know, we look at the cracks and try and work through lower secretaries or other, you know, officials who may have access to those documents and exert, you know, charm and pressure on those individuals, you know, and appeal to, you know, their sense of you're doing the right thing if you give us that document, you know. But you can't, there's no pressure in the government, or there's no law for them to release those documents. In fact, actively trying to keep those documents from us, you know.
I have a question about, my name is Tom Blinkhorn. I'm a former Neiman Fellow, older Neiman Fellow. South Africa. A prosecutor, a group of prosecutors called the Scorpions may still be in existence to root out corruption in South Africa. What relationship, if any, did your newspaper have with the Scorpions?
Okay, well, the Scorpions have been disbanded primarily because they investigate a lot of corruption involving a big arms deal, which ultimately led back to the president. The president's financial advisor was put in prison, and the Scorpions were disbanded amongst much media hysteria, justifiable media hysteria about the fact that this major crime-fighting organization that had a 92% conviction rate was disbanded, and a new organization called the Hawks was set up, which is different in tone and in leadership. The Scorpions had a bit of a tormented relationship with the media. That's one of the reasons that they were disbanded. People talked about the leaks to the newspapers, such as my newspaper. And there were a few incidents of off-the-record briefings that were used to justify this by prosecution's heads, which is certainly arguable on both sides. So we had quite good relationships generally with the prosecuting authorities. But yeah, it's a real pity that it was an overtly political decision to shut them down. It was a real tragedy for the country, I think, because they were seen as the public face of fighting corruption. Yeah, so, I mean, like all journalists, we have good relations, or we try and have good relationships with prosecutors, and often it's successful and often it's not. So, I mean, I'm sorry, does that help at all?
Thank you.
Yes.
James Miller from the MIT Media Lab. I'd like to pick up a theme that several of you touched on, which is the international context of your work, and ask if you could speak to some specific elements of that. For example, there are global media corporations, international human rights law, Western media trainers, all in the mix.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about specific aspects of their influence or not on your work?
I think that they have a good and bad influence, and the good thing is that they are resource entities, and sometimes, especially in Latin America, that there is a high concentration of the print media, and print media is not doing investigative journalism. So the investigative journalism is done by alternative media or new startups online, or I ran a magazine for a year and a half and it failed miserably without any ads. So we are poor. So we don't have resources, we don't have training, and most of the time we are working on very low salaries. So the existence of international and global entities that help journalists they are normally good resources. They are also resources of getting information that we cannot get inside our country. But they are bad in the sense that portrayed a kind of a plain vision of what journalists should be, or don't understand the nuances of every country, and most of the time there is this must-dos that are based on practice in America that normally don't work in an undeveloped country, or don't work, or assume, for example, that print media is the good guy, and sometimes it's not. Or they don't understand that sometimes journalists also get corrupted, and sometimes the owners or journalists are not up to journalism. So,
Stefan, do you want to go there?
I must say that all the things that I learned in the newsrooms working in Romania, it was how not to do journalism. And what I learned, I mean, the good things I learned through meeting foreign journalists and discussing with them, and freelancing for them. Of course, I got very strange requests from, well, media groups like News of the World or MTV or places like that. But also I've got a really good collaboration with, for example, ICAJ, and they will speak about that, I think. So it was a very important working relationship. There is maybe a lot of training that it's like done as a project paper around our region. Maybe that's not that helpful, but the working relationship with foreign media and non-for-profit investigative journalists was really helpful for me.
Okay. Yes.
I'm wondering, you did a Freedom of Information
Could you
Act.
just identify yourself? Sorry for our viewers.
I'm Florence Graves. I'm the founding director of the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis University. It's a nonprofit newsroom, small, very small. When you filed your FOIA, did you find that there was any resistance because you were filing it from a foreign country?
Well,
and also, how difficult was it? I mean, did you have to file lawsuits in order to get, eventually after 2 years, or were you able to file the pleas on your own?
Well, I think the success that we had is down to the fact that it was the American reporter on my staff. It was an American reporter of my staff who actually conducted the FOIA request. And I would be there when he's making the phone calls late at night, and he would have, yes, Cambodia. No, Cambodia. Because he's an American, and he built up relationships over years with individuals inside these departments. And he ground them down. I mean, it was just an unbelievable task on his part. When we started, I said, Douglas, you're on your own. I just, I don't see how this... 2 years later, he delivered the goods. But it took...
It's even difficult for us to get.
Yeah. This was a daily process for 2 years.
But I think it works for, I mean, we don't have the American guy or the Irish accent when we call the people. But we used FOIA as well from Romania. And we used other databases and access, and we were not treated like, from another...
I'm wondering, wouldn't it be interesting if someone got together and, in America, a nonprofit, and made FOIA requests for foreign-based... You know what you want, and we're here. Just throwing that out.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mabel Chan. I'm a visiting scholar at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. This is a question for Kevin. You mentioned earlier there are a few journalists who were killed for
Yes.
the stories they published. I'm curious as to what kinds of stories were life-threatening, and how do you balance the risk to your staff with the benefits to the public?
A lot of those journalists were killed before my time. I wasn't in Cambodia at that time, and I don't know exactly the exact stories that I'd written. It was more in the conduct of their work. Journalists become victims of violence.
Currently, then, on your watch, I mean, do you see any sort of life-threatening, potentially life-threatening?
Not for my staff. I'll tell you now, my staff have been very safe in all the years we've been publishing this since 1993. It's usually local Khmer reporters for local newspapers. One of the problems with local newspapers is they're very politicized as well. They support one party or support another party. So they're already in the mix of politics influence. Even though they're journalists, but they're still in the political realm. And so I warn my reporters, I said, we remain impartial from this, and we conduct professional journalism, which is our best protection, because we don't take sides with anyone. We're not spouting one, advocating on anyone's behalf. We're just journalists, covering all sides. Again, and for that, because of professionalism, I believe it's protected us all these years, I hope that's answered your question.
I'm Nick Daniloff of Northeastern University. I'd like to try to get a brief comment from all four of you on WikiLeaks. Sometimes it is said when a big event happens, is it good for the Jews or is it bad for the Jews? I'd like to rephrase that by saying, is WikiLeaks good for journalism in your country or bad for journalism in your country? Will it encourage freedom or will it encourage reluctance to provide information?
True, I think it's a very good thing, and I can give you a short example. There's this guy I mean, not for my country, but a neighboring country, Ukraine. There's this guy who's been investigated by reporters for the last 10 years, a broker of gas who received the intermediary position for Gazprom shipping gas to Western Europe and other countries. And his links with the organized crime were suspected, but people reporting on that were immediately brought to court in UK, and newspaper in Ukraine have no money to defend themselves in UK. And in the cables, you can read his discussion with the American staff. He asked for this discussion, and he talks about these links with the organized crime. And he says that, I had to do this. I had to have these links with the organized crime, actually with one of the top 10 most wanted people by the FBI, Semyon Mogilevich, because that was the way to do business in this region. So that's just one example, but there are a lot of examples like that. So I hope to see people copying this around my region, and to have Russian leaks or Chinese leaks or whatever.
I think in my country, WikiLeaks have not provided too much information, but like the president saying that Christina Kirchner was unstable. I think that's the only piece of information. But I think the phenomenon has been good to journalism because it has created a headline that doesn't come from El Mercurio, which is the most traditional conservative newspaper, and it has been circulated around social networks. and that's has become a very good source of information outside some type of journalism has lose prestige or connection with the audience.
For my side, I mean, there hasn't been too much about my country that's been particularly entertaining. In Zimbabwe, though, interestingly enough, I mean, Robert Mugabe has used some of the WikiLeaks cables as vindication for his belief that his opponent's really weak. So it's unfortunate that someone like that could use it. But I think it's more important the phenomenon, and I think the way the world reacts to it will determine how sources, the chilling effect on sources, and that could be particularly bad, a desire to root out sources. But I think the debates around it are great. I mean, I think it puts forward the primacy of in the public interest defenses. I mean, that's something that people need to realize is outweighs nebulous notions of countries abusing the concept of national security. And another thing is, I think the fact that it's the journalists that are responsible, and the responsibility of journalists to provide context, to provide to vet things before they put it out, has also been, the primacy of that has been emphasized in this debate, which is a good thing. I'm pretty sure that if a lot of blogs got the WikiLeaks cables, they would have just put them all out on the web. I mean, I'm absolutely sure most blogs, or a lot of blogs, would have just put all of it on the internet without thinking. And so I think the importance of going through it, redacting certain things that you think are not in the public interest, I mean, it's good to make that a primary focus again.
We've had, I think so far, 2 or 3 stories that relate to Cambodia directly inside the cables. And again, like, if it's in the public interest, it's our job to publish. Again, we have to deal with such information in a professional, responsible manner, as you do with any information that comes through a newspaper. On the issue of sources, I think it's one for U.S. State Department, not really for us, because it'll have maybe an issue for their sources. I don't think it'll have any issue for our sources.
Nazila?
My question is for...
Could you identify yourself? Sorry.
Yes, sorry. I'm Nazila Fanti, current Neiman Fellow. What kind of information was it on the cables that you used? I went through the cables, the ones that they were on Iran, very carefully, and there wasn't anything new in it. I mean, most of it was diplomatic communication. Some of it was even based on rumors, some of it. But basically, somebody who had some knowledge about Iran couldn't find anything new. Was there anything about Cambodia or any other country that had crucial information?
Well, it was interesting. It was actually cables that came from Singaporean diplomats talking about, I forget who exactly in the Singaporean government, talking about their impressions of the Cambodian government and the role of Vietnam, Laos, and Burma and Cambodia inside ASEAN, which is very telling, in fact, of what they actually really felt. Beyond the official decorum of their meetings, what they actually feel behind the scenes about each other, and that's quite telling, Yeah, I found it is,
Yes.
I'm Leslie Dunson-Downer. I'm an independent writer, and I just wanted to ask a question again, to everyone about the new media age angle of the conference topic. In particular, the role of the English language, which is so intimately caught up with the whole question of that media age. Noticing that WikiLeaks' publishing partners in different countries, like everyone's mentioned New York Times and Guardian and Der Spiegel, but also Le Monde and País. These papers all publish online editions in English, and many other outlets around the world publish in English. I wonder if you could say something about how language works in this case. What kinds of decisions do you make about what you publish in English or another language, in which instances? And what do you think, I was thinking Alejandro's point about judiciary systems in Chile, which systems people care about, where the ethics matter and people have something invested that makes them want to talk to you. Do you need to choose languages in which those people speak locally as well as a global language to talk about things that matter globally? Just wondering if you could say something about how language affects your work in that case.
I think in the case of El País, it's published in Spanish, and I don't think it would be acceptable for them to publish in English because, for example, in Chile, only 5% of the people understand English, and I don't think that 5% of the people, all of them speak well. They somehow know English, and most of the population don't speak English, and the 5% probably is correlated to the high level income people. So I think language is something, a new tool, skill journalists should have, because you are dealing with a world where the centers of power relates, communicates in English, but you need to translate that to your people. And of course, it's a responsibility, because even if you give the documents to the Chilean population in English, they are not going to, it's a second barrier to make sense of the information. So it's an additional challenge to journalism, and to try to make sense of what's going on in the world. Yeah.
We publish all our national news in Khmer and the leading international stories of the day. So
we publish everything in Romanian, and we have as a policy to translate everything in English, and for some projects in Russian.
El País has, though, it's been interesting, they have this browsable map where you can click on each country and sort of get a look at the cables. Everything is in Spanish until you get to the actual cable, and then the cable is in English. In Germany, actually, there has been, within the past 5 years, a huge trend for all the major papers to also have abbreviated, but by now quite elaborated English language editions. So Der Spiegel, Der Stern, Die Zeit, and so forth do have some of their publications in English. So just as a... Richard, one more question.
Richard Listrana, a Neiman affiliate. Rob, I was struck by your comment that if bloggers had got hold of the cables, they might have just put them all out for everybody to see. Can you explain a bit why you think that is wrong, and who, in this case, then, should be the designated gatekeepers?
Well, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying it's... I just think that's actually what would have happened. I think a lot of blogs... it's more important to have people come to your website. It's more important to develop your brand than to display responsible journalism. That's a huge generalization, and I think it's clearly not true amongst the top, the better-known blogs. But I do think in general that's a more important prerogative for a lot of people. I do think that context is crucial in these in decoding these cables and just putting it out, and seeing what would not be responsible, what would not be in the public interest. I mean, clearly the public interest argument, I think, should hold sway, and if it doesn't meet that, and I think the journalists, you're trained as a journalist, you have a certain professionalism that you're aware of, and you don't need, people who aren't journalists, bloggers, have a certain professionalism as well, and they know this, and I don't think it's across the board that would have happened, but I do think in some cases, some people would absolutely have done that. Unaware of the consequences, perhaps.
I think we're going to have to wrap up now. Let's give a round of applause to our